You know that moment when someone's terrible decision making comes back to bite them in the ass and you get to witness it unfold in real time? That's exactly what happened when director Blake Hammond stormed into my office 2 weeks ago, face red as a fire engine, demanding to know why I hadn't fixed an outage that brought down half of Sage Techco's infrastructure. The perfect irony, since he'd personally canceled my training budget just 14 days earlier, declaring it not mission critical with the kind of corporate smugness that makes you want to document every interaction for posterity. I'm Claire Johnson, Senior Network Engineer at Sage Tech Co., and I've been keeping their digital house from collapsing for the past 4 years. It's the kind of job where you're invisible when everything works, and suddenly everyone's best friend when it doesn't. The company runs on a tangled web of legacy systems that would make a museum curator weep. Ancient servers held together with prayer and electrical tape, networking protocols that predate the Obama administration, and security patches that get applied when we have time, which translates to never in corporate jargon. Sage Tech Company started as a small consulting firm in the early 2000s, back when having a website made you cutting edge and cloud computing was something meteorologists discussed, and over the years, it had expanded through a series of acquisitions and mergers, each one adding new layers of technological complexity without ever cleaning up the old ones. The result was a digital Frankenstein's monster, part modern web application, part legacy database system, part mysterious black box that nobody dared touch because the last person who understood it had retired in 2018. My colleagues were a mixed bag of brilliance and burnout. There was Jake Martinez, our junior systems administrator, who had enough energy to power a small city but lacked the experience to direct it effectively. He'd graduated from a coding boot camp with dreams of revolutionizing enterprise software and had spent the last 2 years slowly realizing that most of enterprise software was held together with the digital equivalent of duct tape and good intentions. Then there was Lisa Chen, our database administrator, who spoke in SQL queries and had an uncanny ability to coax performance out of systems that should have been decommissioned during the Clinton administration. She'd been with the company for 8 years and had developed the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen too many data migrations go sideways. Our team was completed by Alex Rodriguez, the security specialist who spent most of his time explaining why various cost-cutting measures would get us hacked, and why implementing proper security protocols wasn't optional just because they were inconvenient. He joined the company after a stint in government cybersecurity, and you could tell he was still adjusting to the private sector's approach to risk management, which seemed to be ignored until it becomes someone else's problem. The office itself reflected this philosophy of deferred maintenance. The IT department occupied the basement of a converted warehouse where the fluorescent lights flickered with the rhythm of a dying heartbeat, and the air conditioning groaned like a suffering walrus. My desk sat in the corner, surrounded by towers of outdated equipment that doubled as both storage and conversation pieces for the occasional executive who ventured down to see how the magic happened. The basement had originally been designed as storage, and it showed. Low ceilings forced anyone over 6 feet tall to duck around the support beams, and the concrete floors were painted industrial gray, the color of institutional despair. Server racks lined the walls, humming constantly and creating a white noise backdrop that either lulled you into productivity or drove you slowly insane, depending on your disposition. My workspace was a monument to improvisation. 3 monitors of varying sizes and vintages formed a curve of glowing screens, displaying everything from real-time network traffic to system logs scrolling like digital waterfalls. The keyboard was a mechanical model I'd bought myself after the company-issued membrane keyboard died for the 3rd time, and my chair was an ergonomic relic acquired through a complex barter involving Jake's old gaming chair and Lisa's spare monitor. The coffee machine in our break area was older than some interns, and produced a substance technically called coffee, but tasting as if it had been filtered through regret. We kept it running because the alternative, upstairs cafeteria coffee, was somehow worse and came with the added bonus of interacting with people from other departments who might ask why their applications were running slowly. 3 weeks ago, I'd submitted my annual training request for a specialized certification in cloud infrastructure management, a week-long intensive costing $18,500 that would have given me the skills to modernize our creaking system. I spent hours crafting a detailed justification, complete with ROI calculations that would make a finance major weep with joy, risk assessments outlining exactly what would happen if we didn't upgrade our knowledge base, and a timeline showing how this training could prevent the cascading failures lurking in our network like a ticking time bomb wrapped in outdated protocols. The request sat on Hammond's desk for 2 weeks, gathering dust among his collection of motivational mugs and a stack of performance reviews that likely hadn't been touched since the Clinton administration. I'd pass his office daily, watching my carefully crafted proposal become just another piece of paper in his bureaucratic empire, wondering if he even glanced past the dollar sign. Finally, he summoned me into his corner office, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the parking lot and motivational posters that nobody found motivating. Hammond was the type of manager who climbed the corporate ladder by saying yes to executives and no to everyone else, perfecting upward delegation while maintaining plausible deniability for failures below. He had the dead eyes of someone who abandoned genuine human connection around 2019, replacing empathy with efficiency metrics and personal growth with PowerPoint slides. Hammond's office was a shrine to middle management mediocrity. The walls were plastered with certificates from leadership seminars with names like Synergizing Team Dynamics and Leveraging Human Capital for Maximum ROI. His desk was a monument to organization without purpose, color-coded file folders containing printed emails, a desktop calendar duplicating his digital one, and a collection of stress balls that had never been squeezed, because admitting to stress would be admitting to weakness. Behind his desk hung a diploma from a business school specializing in weekend MBA programs for working professionals, framed in the expensive kind that screamed, "I paid for this credential, and I want everyone to know it." Next to it was a photo of Hammond shaking hands with the CEO at some corporate retreat, both wearing the kind of forced smiles that suggested the photographer had taken 17 shots to get one, where both looked engaged and approachable. Motivational posters extolling teamwork, because sometimes you can't do it all yourself, hung next to others preaching persistence. The hard work you do after you're tired of the hard work you already did. The irony was lost on Hammond, who regularly assigned impossible deadlines and then disappeared for long lunches when the inevitable crisis hit. "Claire," he said, not looking up from his phone, where he was apparently engrossed in a riveting game of corporate solitaire about my training request. I recognized the tone, that particular blend of dismissal and condescension that managers perfect in MBA programs. I'd heard it before, the corporate equivalent of a doctor's grave expression before delivering bad news, except doctors at least have the decency to make eye contact. "It's not mission critical," he continued, finally glancing up with the expression of someone who had just solved world hunger by suggesting people eat less. "Budgets are tight this quarter. We need to focus on essential expenses only." I felt that familiar burn in my chest, the one that hits when you watch someone about to make a spectacularly stupid decision, and there's nothing you can do to stop them. The same feeling you get in a horror movie when the protagonist decides to investigate the strange noise in the basement wearing only a nightgown and flip-flops. I'd been at Sage Tech long enough to know that budgets tight was code for I already spent the money elsewhere, and now I'm looking for corners to cut, usually followed by mysterious expenditures on executive retreats and office furniture costing more than most people's cars. "Sir," I said, keeping my voice level despite the growing urge to explain basic cause and effect with small words and hand gestures, "this isn't just professional development. Our current infrastructure is held together with digital duct tape and the collective hope of everyone who depends on it functioning. When, not if, we have a major outage, I won't have the skills to implement the rapid recovery solutions modern systems require. Hammond waved a dismissive hand, the same gesture he used when employees raised concerns about workplace safety, reasonable accommodations, or basic human dignity. You're smart, Claire. You'll figure it out. That's what we pay you for. The condescension was thick enough to cut with a knife and serve at a dinner party. I wanted to explain that being smart doesn't magically download knowledge into your brain like some cyberpunk fantasy. Expertise requires training, and you can't Google your way out of an enterprise-level disaster any more than you can YouTube your way through open-heart surgery. But I'd learned long ago that trying to educate Hammond was like trying to teach calculus to a houseplant, frustrating for me, pointless for him, and ultimately resulting in the same level of comprehension. Instead, I simply said, "Understood. I'll make note of that in my files." Something in my tone must have registered because he looked up sharply, his corporate spider sense tingling. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Just that I want to document our conversation for future reference. Standard practice." His eyes narrowed slightly. Hammond might have been willfully ignorant about technology, but he understood the implications of documented conversations. In the corporate world, documentation is both shield and sword, and everyone knows it. "I don't appreciate the attitude, Claire." "I'm not giving you attitude," I replied, maintaining the same level tone that had served me well through 4 years of corporate nonsense. "I'm acknowledging your decision and following proper protocols." I walked out of his office with my jaw clenched and my hand steady, but inside I was calculating probabilities like a statistics professor on caffeine. Our primary server cluster had been showing warning signs for months, random disconnects that lasted just long enough to make you question your sanity, memory errors that appeared and disappeared like digital ghosts, the kind of hiccups that usually preceded complete system failures. I'd been babying it along with the dedication of a nurse tending to a terminal patient, but I knew it was living on borrowed time. The signs were all there for anyone who cared to look. Error logs that read like a horror novel, performance metrics that would make a cardiologist reach for the defibrillator, and a backup system that was about as reliable as a chocolate teapot. I'd filed reports, sent emails, and given presentations that might as well have been interpretive dance for all the attention they received from management. But now I had something else. Documentation. A paper trail that would lead directly back to Hammond's office when everything inevitably went sideways. I spent the rest of that afternoon updating incident reports, cross-referencing dates, and creating a timeline that even a jury of corporate executives would understand. The documentation process was almost therapeutic. I pulled up months of emails, system logs, and incident reports, weaving them into a narrative that told the story of a system in decline and management's willful ignorance of the warning signs. There were the memory errors that started in March, dismissed as minor glitches, the network, timeouts that began in April, explained away as growing pains, the backup failures in May, labeled isolated incidents. Each piece of evidence was time-stamped, cross-referenced, and stored in multiple locations. I created a folder structure that would survive any attempt at digital archaeology, with copies on local drives, cloud storage, and even printed backups locked in my desk drawer. If Hammond wanted to play games with accountability, I was going to make sure the playing field was level. Jake noticed me working late that evening, the glow of my monitors casting shadows across the empty office. "Everything okay, Claire? You look like you're preparing for war." "Not war," I replied, not looking up from my screen. "Just making sure history gets recorded accurately." He lingered by my desk, young enough to still believe corporate politics could be avoided through competence alone. "Is this about the training thing? Because that's really messed up. We all know you need that certification." It's about more than training, I said, finally turning to face him. It's about what happens when people make decisions based on spreadsheets instead of reality. The truth was, I'd been at Sage Tech long enough to see this pattern repeat itself. Every year, a new cost-cutting initiative sacrificed long-term stability for short-term savings. Equipment replacement deferred, software licenses left unrenewed, training budgets slashed, and then, inevitably, something would break. And everyone would wonder why we weren't prepared. The outage happened on a Tuesday morning at 9:47 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. I was in my office, 3 cups of coffee deep and contemplating the existential crisis of debugging code, older than some of our interns, when every monitoring system I had started screaming at once. It was like being trapped in a digital horror movie, where all the warning bells decided to have a coordinated nervous breakdown. Red alerts cascaded across my screens like digital dominoes falling in slow motion. The primary server cluster had finally given up the ghost, taking with it our customer database, internal communications, and half our web services. Error messages multiplied faster than rabbits in springtime, each one more catastrophic than the last. In the old days, this would have been manageable. I'd implement standard recovery protocols, restore from backups, and have everything running within a few hours while muttering creative obscenities under my breath. But this wasn't the old days anymore. Our infrastructure had evolved into something more complex, more fragmented, more dependent on cloud-based solutions requiring specialized knowledge, the exact knowledge obtainable through training that cost $8,500 and had been deemed not mission critical. I did what I could with the tools I had, restored what I could restore, rerouted what I could reroute, and sent prayers to whatever digital gods might be listening from their silicon heaven. The legacy systems came back online grudgingly, like teenagers dragged out of bed on a school morning. But the new cloud architecture Sage Tech had been gradually migrating to, the one requiring the very certification Hammond had dismissed, remained broken, mocking me with error messages that might as well have been written in ancient Sumerian. By noon, we faced a complete service outage with no clear timeline for recovery. Executives were in full panic mode, fielding angry client calls and watching dollar signs evaporate in real time like money in a Vegas casino. Customer service had abandoned phones, and the sales team hid in the break room like witnesses to a crime. The cascade of failures was spectacular in its completeness. The main customer portal displayed a generic error that might as well have said, "We're sorry, but we forgot how to computer." The internal communication system was down, forcing employees to rely on personal cell phones and hastily created group chats. The accounting system offline meant no payments or invoices could be processed, and even the cafeteria's point-of-sale system failed, producing the surreal sight of executives paying for panic lunches with actual cash. I could hear the chaos from my basement office, footsteps thundering overhead, muffled shouting, and the occasional door slam suggesting someone was having a very bad day. My phone had been ringing constantly until I finally unplugged it, deciding that fixing the problem mattered more than explaining it to increasingly frantic managers. The irony wasn't lost on me that in a building full of people whose jobs depended on functioning technology, I was the only one who actually understood what was broken. Executives upstairs were probably holding emergency meetings about crisis management, while I performed digital surgery with outdated tools. Lisa appeared at my desk around 1 p.m., looking like she'd run a marathon in business casual. "How bad is it?" she asked, though her expression suggested she already knew the answer. "Remember that scene in Titanic where the ship's designer explains the ship will sink because too many compartments are flooded?" I replied, not looking up from my screen. "Yeah, we're the ship. And me." I was exactly where I expected to be, in the middle of a crisis I had predicted but been prevented from preparing for, watching my professional reputation hang in the balance because someone had decided that expertise was optional. The weight of responsibility settled on my shoulders like a lead blanket, made heavier by the knowledge that this entire situation could have been prevented with a single training course and a manager who understood the difference between cost and value. That's when Hammond burst through my office door like a one-man hurricane, his face cycling through shades of red I hadn't seen since my last bad sunburn. He moved with the frantic energy of someone receiving calls from people whose names appeared on organizational charts with boxes drawn around them. "Claire!" he shouted, loud enough that half the IT department probably heard him through the paper-thin walls. "Why didn't you fix the outage? We're losing thousands of dollars every hour." I turned in my chair slowly, savoring the moment like a fine wine. There's something beautiful about watching consequences catch up with poor decisions, especially when you've been forced to watch those decisions being made despite your best efforts to prevent them. "I'm doing everything I can with the resources available to me," I said, gesturing to the screens full of error messages that looked like a digital Christmas tree decorated with failure. "That's not good enough. This is your job." "You're absolutely right," I said, pulling up my email from 2 weeks earlier with the satisfaction of a lawyer producing evidence. "This is exactly the kind of situation I mentioned when I requested training for cloud infrastructure management, the training you canceled because it wasn't mission critical." The color drained from his face as the implications hit him like a freight train carrying a cargo of reality checks. You could practically see the gears grinding in his head like machinery that hadn't been properly maintained. "You're saying you can't fix this?" "I'm saying I can't fix this optimally. I can implement workarounds, but without the specialized knowledge that training would have provided, we're looking at extended downtime and potential data integrity issues." Hammond's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, which was probably the most accurate metaphor for his current situation. Behind him, other IT staff gathered in the hallway, drawn by the commotion and probably enjoying the show like spectators at a particularly dramatic sporting event. "This is ridiculous," he sputtered, his voice cracking slightly. "You should be able to handle this without specialized training." "Should I?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Because 2 weeks ago, you seemed to think this kind of expertise wasn't important enough to invest in. Has something changed about reality since then?" The silence, stretched between us like a taut wire, filled with the ambient noise of failing systems and the distant sound of customer service representatives crying softly into their headsets. I could practically hear the gears turning in his head as he realized he'd painted himself into a corner with the finest brushes of corporate short-sightedness. "Well, can't you just figure it out?" he asked, his voice desperate, like someone who'd brought a butter knife to a gunfight. "I am figuring it out," I replied, "but figuring it out without proper training is like performing surgery with kitchen utensils. Technically possible, but messy, inefficient, and likely to result in complications." The outage lasted 18 hours. 18 hours of lost revenue, angry customers, and executives asking very pointed questions about our disaster recovery capabilities. 18 hours of me explaining to increasingly frustrated clients that yes, we were aware of the problem, and no, we couldn't provide a specific timeline because we were essentially performing digital archaeology on systems that predated proper documentation. I eventually managed to restore most services using a mix of old-school troubleshooting, creative problem-solving, and the kind of digital wizardry that comes from years of experience with systems that should have been retired during the Bush administration. But it was messy, inefficient, and exactly the kind of amateur-hour operation proper training would have prevented. The next morning, I found a training approval form on my desk. Not just for the cloud certification I'd originally requested, but for 2 additional courses Hammond suddenly thought might benefit the team. The irony wasn't lost. What wasn't mission critical on Tuesday was suddenly essential by Thursday, like a weather forecast changing completely once you're already standing in the rain. I signed the forms, but I also updated my resume, because while Hammond had finally learned the value of investing in his team's capabilities, I'd learned something too. I was working for someone who only understood expertise after watching its absence nearly destroy the company. That's not leadership. That's expensive hindsight. The training, when I finally took it, was everything I'd expected and more. The instructor, a grizzled veteran of countless corporate disasters, spent the first day explaining exactly why the kind of outage we'd experienced was preventable with proper preparation. It was like having a doctor explain how a heart attack could have been avoided with basic preventive care. Enlightening, but deeply frustrating. 3 months later, I gave my notice. Hammond conducted my exit interview, and when he asked why I was leaving, I told him the truth. I needed to work somewhere that valued mission-critical thinking before it became mission-critical. His response was predictably corporate. "We're sorry to lose you, Claire. You're a valuable member of the team." "If I were truly valuable," I replied, "you would have invested in keeping me current with industry standards instead of waiting for a crisis to prove my worth." These days, I work at a company that not only approves training requests, but actively encourages professional development. It's amazing what happens when leadership understands that investing in your people isn't just good business. It's the only way to stay ahead of the curve in an industry where the curve moves faster than most can keep up. My new manager, Jennifer, actually reads my training proposals before approving them, asks about implementation timelines and knowledge transfer, and understands that expertise isn't just about having smart people. It's about having smart people equipped with current knowledge and relevant skills. And Hammond? I heard through the grapevine that Sage Tech Company suffered another major outage 6 months after I left. My replacement didn't have the institutional knowledge to handle it, and the training Hammond had finally approved sat unused because no one could be spared during the recovery. Funny how that works. Sometimes the most expensive lesson is the one you refuse to learn until it's too late.